Hey Simon.
Hey,
Ça va?
bien, bien.
I can't speak much French, but I can speak Spanish, but I know that's not useful to somebody who speaks French.
Yeah.
All I know is ça va and et toi? Are you based in Paris?
Yes, the whole dev team is in Paris now, as well as most of the developer solution group.
Okay. See people folding in. Give everyone a couple more minutes to join and then we'll kick it off. Going to lazy link the agenda. Hello, just giving everybody a few more minutes to fold in and then we'll kick it off. I've linked the agenda there. That looks like there's a good agenda up. Alrighty, I think that's most of us. Shall we kick it off?
Yeah, sure.
Alrighty. Hello and welcome to the bi-weekly CNAB community meeting. Today is July 10th. It is a Wednesday. And we have a full agenda. I've linked the agenda in the chat. But the way that we love to start off any of our meetings is to have an introduction for any new folks that are joining us. Do we have any new folks on the line? I'm taking a quick look. But if you're new, please feel free to pop yourself off mute and introduce yourself.
This is Darren Pulsifer from Intel. I've been here, but it's been a while.
Hey, Darren, welcome back.
Thanks.
Okay, taking a look at the agenda, just a few housekeeping items. Can we get a note taker? Who'd like to take notes? If you would like to take notes, go ahead and update and assign it to yourself there. And if you're attending, we'll take a quick list of the names of the people in attendance as well. Okay, so the agenda, the first set of agenda items that we have is review and comment. Shall we go through each of these PRs and pull them up? I can share my screen here. And if whoever put these things on the agenda would like to speak to them. Okay, so yes, introduce relocation mapping.
Yeah, that was me. Had one review from Matt, and a colleague of mine reviewed it, but his review is not binding, so it'd be good to get one other review. I don't think there's much to say. It's been discussed quite a bit.
Yeah, I reviewed it and it's pretty solid. It's a great. He cleaned up the PR cleans up a bunch of little things that have gotten out of sync, and then adds on basically what we all decided. What was it about a month ago at this point?
Yeah.
So I think it. Oh, there we go. Jeremy fixed it.
Good stuff. Okay.
Fantastic. Okay, moving on to Paul 794.
Yeah, this is a blocker for a Duffle release. My colleague Swapnil found this bug yesterday and fixed it. So let's put a fix in. If you look at the bug report, it's quite straightforward to reproduce this. So it seemed like a basic error in Duffle. So basically, it creates a Duffle manifest with a parameter in it, and then tries to specify the parameter, and it says it's not defined in the bundle. It's quite basic. Don't know how it ever got through actually, but yeah, that's life.
Okay, any bundle maintainers on here, or Duffle maintainers that want to take a look at this?
Yep, sure. I'll take a look after that.
Cool. I'll let you self-assign, and then we got another Duffle Paul 792.
This is a major contentious item. It's a one word fix, I think.
A one-word fix.
Just the help text from Duffle Relocate is it's got some old stuff in it. Just need to tidy that up.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Glenn. Okay. Was there anything else that needed review or comments? Okay, moving on to the 1.0 milestone. Who would like to speak to this?
I can speak to it really quickly. So I think we've gotten down to pretty much the end of things. I opened a PR to address number 185. And it's open so people can go take a look at it now. And then the last thing there is that air gap scenarios issue that's kind of been open for a while. Matt Butcher, do you want to address anything there? Is there anything to do for that, or?
Yeah, I think we can probably remove it off the milestone. I think the kind of intention, and it's a shame Chris isn't here, but I think the kind of intention with keeping this open and attached was that we could point people toward what the plan was as far as support of air gap was in 1.0.
Mm-hmm.
But really, when it comes down to it, the next batch of work attached to air gap scenarios has to do with the security spec and then also with the repository spec. So there are no, as far as I can tell from reading through it, mid last week, there were no real actionable steps left on this for the 1.0 milestone. If I'm missing anything, somebody jump in and correct me. But my gut feel, not my gut feel, my informed feel is that we could take this off of the 1.0 one and attach it to the security spec, which I think is our next high priority after core 1.0 is done.
Okay. So if we do that, then the only two things that remain, well, it's really one thing, the issue and the PR associated with the issue. So I think we originally had planned on trying to cut 1.0 on the 15th, which would be Monday. So if we resolve the issue, the PR that I opened, it'll close 185. Do we want to say that we're good for that, or do people want to take a couple days and figure out, and we can reconvene on Slack on Friday or something and determine if we are good for that?
I was gonna suggest that we, rather than jump straight to 1.0, mark this one as a release candidate this week, and then leave it in RC. I think the official taking notes is distracting me from looking things up, but I think we have an official term for it. I think it's draft candidate, maybe. It's in the section 900.
Okay.
but there is a term to capture the fact that we think we're done, but we're leaving it open for things like grammatical fixes.
Would it be possible to add the required action rename issue to 1.0? I feel like that's like a major change that should go in before moving to 1.0.
Yeah,
if we're gonna change it.
I don't want to change stuff. I don't want to change that. I thought about it over the week, so I mean, it's up to the group as a whole, but my concern is a change like that simply for the sake of renaming things where there's no consensus on what they should be renamed to. And where I'm worried about that. But we can discuss, should we discuss that?
Yeah, it's on the agenda.
Oh yeah, it is. Okay, well, we can come back to that.
How about we jump down to that and discuss it now, and then we can.
That's a good idea.
I think you need a refresh, Lockie. There you go. Renaming required actions.
I always somehow think that taking a break when a problem value of the
So what's the current state? Can somebody provide an update who's been watching this? Leah, can you?
I mean, sort of as expected with renaming things, there's not a whole lot of consensus. Everybody has words they particularly don't like, and is like somewhat open to some of the other words. I don't know that I don't think there's like necessarily a clear winner. I feel like provision and deprovision didn't have like anyone who like said that they super hate them. There's several people didn't like create and delete, but there's like one of the recent things that came up was that that Glenn pointed out, which I think is important, is like deciding whether you want to use the verb a CNAB as a phrase, because that's why create and delete are objectionable. Because like if you want to say create a CNAB, you expect the results to be a CNAB bundle. But if you want to use create as the verb in these required actions, then you expect the result to be the thing that a CNAB creates. So therefore, you probably shouldn't use the phrase create a CNAB in the documentation as like the casual way of referring to these actions.
So what I had done for Helm when we went through this same debate was I composed a document that went through all the package managery things I could find and audited what verbs they used for things. And so I just dropped that into chat. And what you'll see is that by and large, by almost entirely across the board, with only a couple of exceptions, the term is install and then upgrade for changes. And then when you get to delete, then things get a little messy. They kind of go all over the place. So my primary argument in favor of leaving them the same would be to rely on existing UX for other tools and say the verbs install and upgrade seem to be fairly well understood and almost exclusively used to describe what we're doing.
This is actually precisely my counter argument for why not to use install and uninstall, because we are not installing local software with bundles. We're installing stuff, we're like doing stuff in the cloud. Install is a word that I only associate with local package managers. Like kubectl does not use install because like install is for all of these local package managers on your local computer that aren't creating resources in the cloud.
I don't see the difference other than where things are getting created. So
I agree. I mean,
Go ahead, sorry.
no, when I install an application, I don't really care where it installs or how many microservices or how many resources it consumes. I'm installing that application for its capabilities that it's going to provide me. That's how I see it.
I think that for me, the big thing here is not necessarily the verbs that are used, but the nouns. Like, to me, the thing that's interesting, that's different, I think, about many of these package managers is that in a lot of cases, so you're doing something like, you know, gem install X. In that case, like, there is a canonical X gem that gets installed and a canonical X gem that gets updated and uninstalled. There really is only one of those things. In the case of CNAB, you're talking about there being a bundle, which is a representation of the bits you need and the configuration that's available for you to install an instance of that particular cloud software. But you can install n instances of it if you want. And so there is this separation of what it means to install a bundle. There can be many installations of the bundle with different names and at different versions. And this is decidedly different than the way that like most package managers work, where there's like a canonical one thing. When I install some tool, I have that one tool that's canonically there. And so it makes sense for me to then say things like, I'm going to upgrade that tool. In this case, it isn't necessarily that I'm upgrading the bundle. I'm upgrading an installation of that bundle that is named. And I might be choosing not to update some other versions of the bundle intentionally. In that case, I think I just get confused with like phrasing like I'm going to install the bundle. It just is like, I don't know, it seems clumsy to me in that that phrasing, like what the actual meaning of what the operation of performing.
What would you do with the bundle then? Someone's created a bundle. What verb would you use?
Well, the spec canonically refers to these instances of bundles as installations. So to me, you're really talking about the life cycle of an installation, not the life cycle of a bundle. So you would probably have phrasing like create an installation, upgrade an installation, remove an installation. Or you could maybe even say, fine, install an installation. I think it's slightly clumsy in terms of just installing an installation. The English language is kind of a little bit weird in that case, but I think the noun you're actually talking about in most of these cases is the installation, not necessarily the bundle. And I just think that like when we phrase it like install the bundle, while the bundle has a place in this, it isn't really the thing that's being operated on.
No, I agree with you there. In fact, I remember when I first read the spec, it was confusing on the difference between a bundle and an instantiation of the bundle, which was called an installation. That part was confusing, so maybe we need a little more definition between the two.
That being said, I'm for pragmatic reasons, I totally understand not moving forward on this, but just making it something that we would readdress or think about in a future version of the specification. I understand that point of view as well.
Just another angle. I made the point in the issue that whatever we decide formally, we're going to have to talk about this in public and informally. And if we end up with a mouthful of words, we'll just trip over ourselves and we'll end up abbreviating it. So we've got to have a phrase like install the CNAB or set up a CNAB or something, or some pithy expression that means install an installation instance of a particular CNAB, that kind of thing. If we haven't got a pithy phrase, it's hopeless. And I agree about the pragmatic aspect. If we put this change in, if we made a change now, I think we'd need a few weeks to shake out all the details.
What was the feedback on Helm? Because this feels like the same problem that Helm has, because when I install a Helm chart, I'm creating a release, I think is the right terminology that Helm uses, right? It's the same thing, and Helm uses install. And has there been any feedback about that being confusing?
That's what that document was for, was because there was discussion of whether Helm should use the same verbs as kubectl.
No, what I meant, Matt, was that Helm's been out there for some period of time, and therefore, since that doc was written, you've got some feedback from Helm, and presumably.
Yeah, largely we haven't gotten too much. There was some discussion around Helm 3 of whether we wanted to change the verbs to use the kubectl verbs, but really there was only one person who was interested, and everybody else felt like staying with package manager lingo was good, or at least only one person expressed support for it. But in that case, it's kind of different because we were very much, people are very resistant to changing the CLI for Helm. So yeah, nobody seems to be confused by it, but again, it's like this. There are differences of opinion about what the names should be. And once, yeah.
So I suppose my point would be, if no one's confused by Helm, there doesn't seem to be, by Helm's approach, there possibly isn't a good reason to consider making a change at this time.
I mean, the reason that we brought this up wasn't about whether people are confused by the sort of core default use case of you can use a bundle to create software applications in the cloud. Because like install is like okay to stretch that to like mean installing software resources in the cloud. It's that because bundles are generic enough that you can use them to create more like bindings, like you can for any resource that you want to manage, where there's like a start, some kind of updating, and then a deletion. You can use them to more generically manage things like bindings, like creating a user account on a database and then later deleting it. That's like also something you could manage with a CNAB. And it was very hard for us to communicate that to some of our internal stakeholders as like one of the various options for how to structure their usage of bundles. And like that is an option for how they could structure it, but because it says install and uninstall, that like wasted a lot of our time in meetings. And something that's more generic, create, destroy, start, delete, like almost anything else on that list would have saved a lot of time in communicating.
So it seems like we don't have consensus. Is everybody okay? We can continue to riff on this until we get some consensus, and which means that the only decision that we're making today is not to put it in the 1.0 milestone. Is that a...
Yeah, can we sort of agree that if it turns out that this is something we want to do, then we will consider it in the between the final draft and release of the spec? Because I want to respect the fact that we have no consensus. So if we have no consensus, we want to make sure that we can still change it between now. Oh, sorry, Carolyn, go ahead.
Got her hand up.
Sorry, I'm a little late. Had to hit the dentist up this morning. I wanted to ask if anyone has talked about this yet, that regardless of the verbs used in the spec, tools can use whatever wording user experience they want and then map that onto verbs. So for example, this doesn't only apply to Duffle. Duffle's using like the spec verbs, but Docker app or Porter or the Riff can use different verbs, custom verbs. And then, so for example, like some of the verbs I know are kind of long. It could be like io.docker.com.status or something like that, and they could shorten it to status. Or Porter could have something called pre-flight. It may be a very long verb, and we may call it something different. things like that, and we can shorten it to something differently. Would this be an interesting use case where we could use a different verb than what's defined in the spec and then map it? So if someone wanted to use provision, but the spec says install, the tool could use the word provision instead. Something to chew on.
Yes, I think that would be fair.
Just for clarity, to make sure I understand, Carolyn, what you're proposing here, the mapping is happening inside. So like the runtime is mapping for the invocation image. The invocation image wants to say, like, I have a bash script that's looking for what action was invoked. The image inside the invocation image, you would be passing in like a different variable than what's a different action than what's specified in the spec? Or are you talking about a CLI tool that's like invoking the runtime that would have a different action?
Yeah,
okay,
I was saying that the tool could create their own user experience and maybe mapped better to whatever you're trying to provide. But the bundle authors, whoever's writing the invocation image, would be using whatever the spec lays out. So if the spec says provision, but for example, Porter wanted to continue using install, we could. And then Porter would do that internal mapping then of saying, we chose to keep using install. When we execute the invocation image, we're going to pass in provision as the action though, because we know that install is actually provision, because maybe we changed install to provision in the spec in this example.
Yeah, so that was our plan entirely, external to the runtime, to have our own tool use words that map more closely to the use cases we're thinking about solving for. The stakeholders in particular that we have been talking to who've been tripping over this are bundle authors. They're the individuals who would actually be building bundles with verbs that are defined in the spec. They're the folks that seem to have a little bit of trouble mapping this in their heads about what's actually happening. So yeah, I think we agree with you that like tools should cater to like the particular use cases and like use the words that make sense for those use cases. I think we still struggled with like folks who are having to build bundles, getting them to understand things like when I have an action called upgrade, what's being upgraded? Is it the installation or the bundle somehow? What does it mean to have upgrade called on a bundle that's a newer version, say a prior one? Like lots of those kinds of questions that resulted in considerable amount of like back and forth discussion.
Okay, thanks, Brian. That really helps. I didn't quite grasp that the concern with the words, the verbs, was educating bundle authors and not the end user of the CLI.
That actually might be one of the problems that we're seeing is we're using, there's two distinct objects that are being created here, right? A bundle and then an instance of that bundle running, right? And we haven't really well defined those, unless it's what you guys, if I remember in the spec, it used the word claim at one point, but that wasn't the full object either. It's more like an application, but that opens up a can of worms.
So recently I actually, Leon and I opened up a PR against the claims specification. And interestingly enough, there's some mixed use of words in that. I think the claim document continues to refer to that as a release, the instance of a bundle as a release. I think that might be like an artifact from like just, you know, maybe it was called release before it was then called installation. But I would agree, I don't feel like we have anywhere, like we have a definition of bundle and I think everyone has a consensus or agreement of what that actually means. I'm not sure we have that, the second one, that's installation, and like conceptual idea of like what are the life cycle events that installation goes through and how those might map to words that make sense when we discuss those things and explain how the specification works.
I agree there. We've got to figure that one out. Maybe not for 1.0, but maybe for the next rev. I don't know.
Like I said earlier, I am totally open to taking the pragmatic route and saying like we can iterate on this in the future. I think we just wanted to provide feedback here that we have heard some friction and like misunderstanding, and so we just wanted to make sure that that was voiced in like the community forum.
Okay, so we'll keep riffing on that issue, but we'll pull it out and make sure it's not in the milestone for 1.0. Is that the only action for now? Everybody's in agreement? There's only two hard problems in computers. One's naming, the other one is cache and validation. So let's move on to cache and validation.
and I thought the third one was off by 1 errors.
Off by 1. It is, actually. It is off by 1. See, I was off by 1. I'm glad you caught the joke. Okay, so I'm just refreshing the agenda, and I think there's one item remaining, and that is to discuss dependencies, discuss current state versus desired state of dependencies. Would like
Can I ask a dumb procedural question as the note taker? Do I move that item to the bottom of the list so that the log reads? I'm just going to do that.
Yeah, you do that. Do that. Thank you. You have our blessing. So dependencies, whose item was that?
That's mine.
Would you like to speak to that?
I would. So a couple months back, we collaborated on adding a pretty simple specification that was outside of the core CNAB spec for dependencies, where you could say a bundle requires a named bundle, like I need MySQL 5.7, say there was a bundle tagged and pushed to a registry out there called MySQL 5.7. I need that executed before I run. And so we worked on that and put it out there, and it was kind of like an optional external to the core 1.0 spec. And but we didn't really have anything implemented at that point to kind of vet it. And I started working on this in Porter, because Porter has dependencies right now, but it's not based on the spec. And I came to the realization that having it as an optional part of the spec, where it may or may not be implemented, is going to be very tricky. So I just walked through what I started to realize. So let's say that Porter makes a bundle that has metadata inside the bundle.json that says, hey, I'm like a WordPress bundle and I depend on MySQL, and I need MySQL to be run before I run because it's going to generate outputs that I depend on, like, a host and a connection string, essentially. There's a couple things missing to make that work. So let's say that I need to be able to have that guaranteed to run. All of a sudden, there's no real way to say, depending on what tool executed my bundle, my WordPress bundle, I don't have that guarantee anymore that it was run, because it's an optional part of the spec. It's not part of the core spec. So I was starting to get into all these weird questions about, like, well, what happens if it doesn't get run? What happens if a tool that doesn't support the dependency spec executed my WordPress bundle? How am I supposed to know to fail? How am I supposed to know that dependencies wasn't supported? Tools that don't support dependencies, are they supposed to check for things they don't support and then fail and stop? Is my bundle just supposed to go kerplop? Are they supposed to look for things and then know that they're supposed to fail? I mean, the whole point of the CNAB spec is that anybody can run a bundle. And this kind of immediately made that guarantee not work, which was really worrisome to me. And the other piece of that is that dependencies were always intended to work with outputs. And we were kind of missing the last piece, which is we're putting outputs into a well-known place, but there's no way to load outputs into the next bundle who needs it. And that's another thing that I immediately was like, oh, I want to put this back into the spec. But again, if there's no guarantee that it's going to be loaded in, but depending on which tool is doing this, I hope you see my point. Every time I say there's no guarantee, my response was just, I'm just going to implement this in Porter so I know that there's a specific like guaranteed experience. At which point I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like undermining every single part of why we're doing a spec here. So I really like to see dependencies just be part of the core spec. And I don't know if it's too late or if anyone else is interested in this, but I basically see like it either needs to go in all the way and be part of core, or it needs to come out, or we need to find some way for a bundle to say, I absolutely need this optional part of the spec, or you shouldn't run me. What do people think? I know that was a lot.
So how do specs like XML which have tons and tons of extensions work?
I mean, like at the root, right? You define like an extra namespace, and that prefixes things. So like you can say like, here's an extra namespace, foo, and then there's a big extra definition for it. And then later on, when you are using a node, you'd prefix foo colon whatever foo dependencies. And someone would have to know how to read that and work with it in order to even work.
And if they don't, like if you use the Xlink spec and the user agent doesn't supply Xlink, what does the spec say happens? I'm pretty sure that the way that XML took and the way that HTML takes is if an optional part of an extension specification happens, the user agent just is free to ignore it or do whatever.
Yeah, I get that part. But the question is like the user experience for bundles, the whole point of having a spec. Like if I load up a bundle in a tool that doesn't support dependencies at all, what happens? Like we say like, hey, CNAB means anyone can run it, right? If I use one tool, it'll work. Like, how do we give people a way to go, shoot, I'm using a tool that doesn't work. It was made with one tool and it won't work with another. How do we at least tell people? And are we okay with doing that? Or does it kind of undermine having a CNAB spec?
I mean, this is in the bundle.json file, right? So you can flag it, but any tool that allows you to have extensions means that if you make frequent use of the extensions, you will provide a degraded experience for people who don't use the extensions. And making it mandatory in the spec makes the spec substantially more complicated for people to implement and forces some people who don't want to implement dependencies to implement it anyway.
Well, that's why I'm asking, because other companies were interested, that's why we started working on dependencies in the first place. So I'm asking Pivotal, Docker, are we interested in having it being part of the spec or not? Because the way it is now, optional, I don't see it as a viable experience at all to even have it be an optional thing in the spec, because it makes basically a tool-specific bundle, which I think is kind of worthless.
But again, I mean, lots of other standards provide the same thing and provide for the fact that if you as the bundle, if you as the HTML author, if you as the XML author, if you as the whatever author choose to implement additional stuff, you're gonna have some set of user agents that can't handle it. I don't think this is, from a specification point of view, I don't think this is a showstopper at all. I think this is how tooling ecosystems grow up, and then a browser may notice it and say, we don't support that, and give that as an error message, or it may simply ignore it. But I don't think it is a good argument to say, well, because I want to introduce an extension that will introduce a different behavior, I want to force everybody to implement that particular extension.
I'm not saying I want to force everyone to implement it. That really isn't.
If we include it in the core spec,
Matt,
in the core spec, we are.
Are you looking, so like, I feel like there's three possible behaviors that have been mentioned here. One of them is the desire for everyone to implement the behavior. One of them is for runtimes that don't support the extension to just ignore that part, which will just break at runtime, which seems sad for users. And one of them is for some way for bundles to say, I must have this extension. If you don't have this extension, say so now and don't run me.
Yes.
And to maybe make that some part of the schema, like we already have a bundle version schema, to maybe have a list of extensions or something, kind of like WebSockets has like a way to like list schemas when you're like doing the handshake. Something like that where you can have like a list of strings and say, if you don't recognize this string, say so now that you can't run me because you don't support this extension. Maybe we could have something like that so that you have this flexibility to say, I don't do this extension. I'm going to stop now because you require this.
I like that.
Way.
I like that a lot. I would be totally.
That's what I was trying to suggest as one of the options. Yeah. Is that we either need to like, it'd be great if other people want it, we can put it in, or we need to like be able to say something, but failing at runtime kind of is a really awful option. Thanks, Leah. I appreciate you seconding that.
Yeah, the other way I've seen it expressed is registered capabilities, which are basically like I'm capable of processing dependencies. So you have that as a registered capability. And I guess the spec just says you can have a field that's optional that is capabilities. So that the tool could say, I need these things, and you could, you know, fail early and say, well, I can't process dependencies, for example, and throw back an error to the user.
I agree with Leah's point. I think we might need a force option that says, I don't support that extension, but I'm going to ignore that anyway. But that's by the by. But another point is that I think it's probably premature to put it in the core because I don't think we've had enough experience with using it yet. I'd like to see the dependencies stuff actually used in practice a bit before we build it into the core. So I suspect we're going to make some mistakes. It's quite a nasty area.
I agree with that. I like extensions as a way to figure out in practice what things should look like.
Yeah, if we have a way to have like a fail-safe handle to go, I am a runtime and I don't even know how to deal with this extension, I'm going to stop. That would be great as a way to test things out without having an awful user experience, which would be great.
Or a way to indicate whether the extension is required or optional.
Yeah.
I'm cool with not adding the dependencies themselves to the spec, the core part, but I think we should add something to allow people to flag what's required for their bundle as part of the core. And we should do that for 1.0, I think.
Why is that necessary for 1.0?
How is it necessary? I don't think it's necessary, but I think it's going to be a crucial thing for going forward. So we should do it now rather than kick the can down the road for some indeterminate amount of time.
Can somebody want to volunteer to draft it?
Yeah, I think I can volunteer and I'll ping other people unless somebody else wants to draft it.
And is that just actually naming optional parts of the specification as being required for this bundle, or is it just arbitrary values that can be or is it like I need the dependency spec, the security spec, the distribution spec? Is it just named optional pieces of the spec, or is it arbitrary anything?
That's a good question.
It needs to be arbitrary, right? If we don't describe dependencies in the spec.
Yeah, because I think we'd want this to be able to work with completely external. Like, for example, if we needed to add a particular extension for our stuff to work internally, I think we'd want it. But maybe I don't know. This is probably an implementation detail that can be hashed out in the queue, I guess. I would like to bike shed on it, but I'll shut up.
Okay, so Jeremy's running point to draft the change, and we'll bike shed on it in the issues comments. Is there anything else we didn't cover against that point, Carolyn?
No, that would be really great.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Carolyn. Do we have any other agenda items? I think we've made it through everything that's there.
Yeah, I think that was it.
Okay. Opening it up for any other business.
We're going to do a Duffle release this week, I think, if we merge that other stuff. Simon Davies was interested in that. I think Glenn was interested in that.
A colleague of mine found another problem, so he's going to hunt that down today. And if that really is a problem, I'll get it fixed in tomorrow. So hopefully we'll get a release tomorrow.
I said earlier that Leah and I had opened a PR against claims. This is really in an effort to figure out how to do outputs for Duffle. I think there was a very long-standing open issue that Michelle had written down that just said, we should do that outputs thing in Duffle. And so I think that we wanted to just get some clarity from some of the folks who've actually been working a little bit more in the Duffle code base about kind of what the plans for that kind of thing are. We're happy to do the implementation ourselves. We just want some better insight into like, does it make sense for us to extend the claim spec to say claims also store things like outputs and then make them available through Duffle somehow? Bringing that to folks' attention.
Yeah, I started to look at that today. Vaughn is looking at doing that output implementation inside of Porter right now. So I think we should have some follow-up discussions inside of your claims issue that you opened.
Okay, if there's nothing else, fantastic. Thank you for joining. Have a great day.
See you guys.
Bye.